Hi guys, I'm Mike and this is F1 Fanatics. Welcome back guys to another F1 Legacies, and joining me today is a very big fan of the driver that is our F1 Legacy today, and that is David from a DJN Noble F1 YouTube channel, or just you'll know him on David Noble on Twitter as well. We regularly interact. He's been on for Feeder Series, he's been on for an F1 Worldwide, and as we're doing this F1 Legacies video, when we're talking about Gilles Villeneuve, I had to bring you on, David. So welcome onto the channel.
Well, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
That's no problem at all, David. You've almost become a little bit of a resident on the channel, the amount of times we've got you on as well. But it's nice to have you on camera, actually, as well. And a nice little complicated setup going. It looks slightly... We've both got hats in the background, so we've coordinated definitely on that. But as
Today it'll be a photo, another day it might be something else. I haven't quite got a permanent setup, so it's sort of fluid.
Oh, well, fluid's the best way. It keeps people kind of wondering what's going to go on, what's going to be in the background next.
People will be watching my videos just to see what the whole of my living room looks like.
Exactly. You see, I mean, we've got a parody account on our sofa now, so clearly, clearly everything's a little bit random on that front. But anyway, we are not here to talk about just David's setup and our hats in the background. We are actually here to talk about the late, great Gilles Villeneuve. And he is an interesting one to have on these F1 Legacies, because obviously the previous ones we've had have been obviously Charlie Whiting, you know, massive influence on the sport. Safety-wise, Sterling Moss, regarded as one of the greatest drivers not to win a world championship, but, you know, sustained a long life during these things. Michael Schumacher as well had that massive two-part podcast with Rob, and then recently with Dan we looked at the great Bernie Ecclestone and his interesting path during F1. But Gilles, he hasn't won a world championship and he doesn't have many kind of statistics that kind of stand out, but he is a man that has left his mark on the sport. He's left his mark, exactly, and he's left his mark on kind of people. You know, you for one, in terms of you weren't following Formula One in the times that Gilles was alive, but you know, he's become one of your favourite drivers because even just watching the replays of Gilles, he was an infectious talent that almost keeps F1 pure, I think, is probably the best way to describe it. But as we usually do on F1 Legacies, we're going to go back at the start, look through his career, and then me and David will take the time to kind of talk about what we think Gilles Villeneuve's legacy is on Formula One. And we'll start off with obviously the early life, and well, we got to start off with Gilles basically funding his way into racing, which was pretty common for the time, I think, but it was his vamped up Ford Mustang, I think it was.
He was doing some of that, yeah, drag racing and stuff. Basically, the problem with it was because it was in just a straight line. It wasn't. I think he got bored of it. These days we'd call it a thrill seeker, but other people basically said he didn't have any fear. You know, that sort of sense where other people's limits are just different to everyone else's. That's kind of how it was with him. So then from there on to like snowmobiling and stuff when he was 17, and by 19 he was getting paid for it. But paid in a sport like that is a little bit different to how it is in professional sports now, you know. But he always loved racing and always loved driving fast. And when he was a kid, he'd be sitting on his dad's lap driving a car. And then when he was 11, he got allowed to drive a pickup truck around the fields and thrashed that. There's a story that apparently he managed to, when he was 15, he got given or was lent occasionally the keys to the family car to just drive it up and down the drive and what have you to get used to driving. And then he got keys cut for himself. And after he left a friend's party one night, him and a friend decided to take it out for a drive, and he wrapped it round a tree. And apparently, the driver's side door was bent in right to the transmission tunnel in the middle. And the friends ended up walking home, and he was very guilty in the morning. The police turned up in the morning and sort of said, "Someone stole your car." Now, you wouldn't have blamed him if he'd have seen that as a get out and not said anything, but he still owned up anyway because he was brought up believing that you had to be honest. And that was something that sort of held throughout the rest of his life.
I think, yeah, I think that is the measure of the man. I've actually, I've got a few quotes with it because just, I think some of these quotes bring Gilles to life a little bit better than there. And the kind of late great Nicky Lauda said he was the craziest devil I ever came across in Formula One. The fact that for all of this, he was a sensitive and lovable character rather than an out and out hellraiser made him such a unique human being. And I think, that story about him, taking his parents' car and wrapping it and still owning up, it shows that he just had this insatiable desire for speed. He loved racing in its kind of purest form. He loved kind of, pushing the limits of what any vehicle could do that he could get his hands on, basically. But yet, underneath all of that, he was just a really genuinely great human being and just a really nice guy.
Yeah.
I think we'll focus first on his snowmobile career because it basically funded his way, like you mentioned there, into racing, which seems bizarre. I mean, I don't know how many drivers have gone along the route of, obviously you bring sponsorships in and the paid drivers element of it is often a hot topic, and back then much of the great drivers were paid drivers who came in. But yeah, Gilles Villeneuve paying his way to compete off the back of his snowmobile sponsorship, he's certainly one of the more interesting ones, to say the least.
I mean, the thing is when we say the snowmobile racing was paying for it, in perspective, I think one year he won the world championship in snowmobiling and earned about $14,000 for it. And having got his racing license to be able to race in the summer as well, he went looking for a drive in Formula Atlantic, and the guy he was talking to was sort of like, "Okay, that will cost us about $50,000 to $60,000 for two chassis and some engines." And Jill, whereas most of us might have been like, "Okay, the budget doesn't add up," Jill basically shook the guy's hand and then had to go back and tell his wife that he'd sold their home.
I mean, uh, he had a very understanding wife, that's for sure. Uh,
So she just knew that there was no point arguing with him about something he'd set his mind on, because kind of like reminds me of like the stories you hear about Frank Williams, where basically it was such a narrow focus that if he had a goal, it was like nothing else was going to get in the way of that or change that. That focus was everything. Um, basically, Joanne was kind of used to it by that point in their relationship.
yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that Frank Williams comparison is, very good. There's a few of those stories within the sport. Obviously it renowned, especially in its early years of Formula One, that it was just a rich boys club, and it was just this kind of elitist background. And I know obviously some people still today think it is, with the extortionate amount of money that's included to be competing within motorsport in the modern day. But yeah, back then you had these guys who were just, I love racing, I'm going to get into racing, I don't care how I'm going to do it, I don't care what the sacrifice is, I'm going to do it. I mean, you look at someone probably who's got a long lasting legacy in motorsport as a whole, and Carroll Shelby, he basically, went through several careers just before he found his way of building cars and making a business that way. And that was the mark of those guys at the time. It was a all costs element of it, and Shields definitely kind of fell into that category.
Yeah, no compromise. It was you found the way of doing it at whatever cost it took.
Absolutely, and I think going back to the snowmobiles, I've got I the snowmobile racing intrigues me because I'm like, back in the 60s and 70s, I mean, I'm going to go with the quote that I think he credited some of his learning. Obviously, he was renowned in Formula One for his great car control and, just being this driver who could just drive the car on the limits and have such control over it. And he said every winter you would reckon of on 3 or 4 big spills, and I'm talking about being thrown onto the ice at 100 miles per hour. Those things used to slide a lot, which taught me a great deal about control, and the visibility was terrible. Unless you were leading, you could see nothing, with all the snow blowing about. Good for the reactions, and it stopped me having any worries about racing in the rain. I mean, that's the biggest understatement in the world, I think. Uh, Rain seems nothing compared to, I imagine, being on snowmobiles with snow flying up in your face.
Well, yeah, zero visibility, and at any time, someone could be stopped stationary in front of you, and you'd have to try and dodge out of the way on a slippery surface. Um, so it takes a lot of bravery to do that sort of thing. Um, to a certain extent, that was why maybe he had a certain advantage over some of the other competitors, and why he won the world championships he did.
Yeah, I think that's especially in the not as big series that he competed in with. Obviously, the Formula Atlantic was where he gained his first success. I believe he won in 76 and 77, didn't he?
So 75, and he competed, and that was like the 50 to 70,000 pound having to sell the house year. He finished fifth in that year, having broken his leg after round four. 6 weeks later, he was back racing it again. Um, but going into the 76 season, the team Akuri Canada had wanted to hire him again, but for whatever reason, his sponsorship fell through about 3 weeks before the start of the season, and they had to hire someone else. And then it was sort of like they ended up having to self-fund a car and an engine, and somehow scrape together some mechanics and whatever to go racing. And that year was actually really very good for them. So it's strange how it works out. But he we've had conversations with younger racing drivers and whatever before, where you've had the in terms of basic ability and technical prowess and skill at driving, they feel like they could match anyone out there. But what was happening was they felt because of the money available to them, they were just getting out engineered. And what Gilles found, certainly to start with in his career, was there were times when you had other teams breaking out whole new engines, and he was there himself with a set of spanners trying to work on his own car, getting it ready, and he was then tired for the racing.
It's often I think about guys like this and around about that time who, clearly had the natural gifted talent, but it wasn't handed to them. It almost instills this inner hunger, I think. There's just an absolute desire to be successful, and when you achieve success like he did in the 76 and 77 season, you know it was all the more special because of how hard he'd had to work, what he'd sacrificed to get there. And, it was just something pretty incredible, uh, that he would then, off the back of this, have. Well, it was in a Formula Atlantic non-championship round, wasn't it, that James Hunt first came across him?
Yeah, that was the 76 year after Gilles had just rounded it up. James Hunt and I think it might have been Alan Jones were teammates with him at the Akiri Canada team he was in. And obviously, James was like fighting for his F1 championship, and he was just tagging along because the attendance money had been quite good and that had been offered to him. And it's sort of like suddenly, him, the Formula One driver, came up against this Formula Atlantic guy, and it was like he couldn't actually stay with him. It's like, well, I want whatever setup he's got. And the irony about that is that apparently the car that Gilles had was handling like a complete dog, and it was tail out, sliding all over the place, and he actually was having a hard time keeping hold of it. And it wasn't until that he got the other car back that James Hunt was running, he realised the setup on Hunt's car was actually a lot better than the one he'd had.
That is, I, I think, although Gilles had an understanding, I think, especially when you're in those kind of lower ones, you have to make the most of your machinery, and it goes back to the real great drivers find a way of getting results or getting performances out of cars they really shouldn't be getting those results or performances with. And, clearly Gilles had shown that. And to be noticed by a really big shot in F1 at the time, obviously, yeah, like you said, James Hunt fighting for his Formula One world champion, which he would obviously eventually go on to become world champion that year. It was just, it was impressive that he could stand out that much, and also amazing that James Hunt, and it showed the kind of gentleman nature of the time, that he put his neck on the line and said to McLaren, "You need to look at this kid."
It has also been pointed out that James going over to another country and racing in a junior lower down series. I mean, Formula Atlantic was apparently the equivalent of about F3 at the time. And can you imagine any of the Formula One guys going and racing an FIA F3 now? So it just wouldn't happen now. But of course, if he drops down to a series like that in a Canadian home series, not much different to say someone racing in British F3 now, almost, and he gets beaten, then it kind of makes sense for him to big up the person who beat him, because then that kind of makes him look better as well.
It's a very good point. You certainly don't want to be going, "Oh God, this guy's beat me. I'm going for a Formula One World Championship, and he's in a regional F3 equivalent, and he's shown me up here today." But yeah, in fairness, though, the character that James was,
Yeah, I'm being a bit flippant there, but
yeah, I certainly agree, and certainly some drivers would, but James, certainly the character he was, always said it how he was, and he didn't really care who he was up against or who he was racing. He just enjoyed racing and having a good time while doing it. And if he noticed a top talent like Gilles, he's the type of bloke who always was going to do it. But obviously, he went over to McLaren, he impressed, and he got his debut in the British Grand Prix, I believe it was, in 1977, where he kind of split the two McLaren teammates, didn't he?
well, the thing is, he was also running in the older M23 chassis, whereas they were running the newer M26. And I know that the M26 wasn't exactly one of McLaren's best efforts, but it was still better than the older car. Um, he was just massively unlucky in that race. There was a fault light come on the dashboard. He was running, qualified like ninth in the older car, and was running happily around, running competitive times and stuff. And then a fault light came up on the dashboard, and he ended up going into the pits and losing like 2 laps in the pits. And it turned out that the fault was with the light. There was nothing actually wrong with the car. So then he came out of the pits and, 2 laps down, and was still running on the pace of the other cars, and ended up finishing 2 laps down, which in his first race in Formula One in a car he didn't know very well. Um, One of the weird things, of course, is always like in practice, most people drive up to the edge of like the level of the car and build up to it. But after he'd spent about 2 laps working out the track and which way the corners went and what have you, basically he went flat out the whole time and apparently managed to spin on basically every corner of Silverstone because he was trying to learn where the limit was, which was a lot of people found incredibly strange. But what they found even more strange was that he managed to do so without losing hardly any time, because he was losing maybe a second a lap spinning, because basically he always had an eye on where he was on the track. And as soon as it got nearly straight, he managed to put his foot down again and get going again, barely losing any time. But that was how he learnt the track and learnt the fastest way around the corners at Silverstone, was by kind of going around them in circles.
I mean, I always think there are two very distinct ways that people approach F1. There are the methodical thinkers who plan their races and go about it, and they understand and they know what they need to do, and they drive within the limits as much as possible. The Lauders, the Prosts, even Hamilton to an extent in modern day. Those are the drivers that have developed into that. Then you have the natural raw talents who just don't think about it. They just race and they don't care what anyone else does. They just go, this is how I'm going to win races, and I just want to drive as fast as possible. Gilles definitely falls into that category. The Sennas of the world fall into it. Um, shoot, and you just go, they're incredible talent. James Hunt probably falls into that one, and Kimi Raikkonen certainly in his early years falls into that category.
Well, the one who Gilles looked up to most was Ronnie Peterson. And the irony about that was that when Gilles got through to F1, Ronnie Peterson was complaining about how dangerous Gilles was driving, when Gilles had always looked at Ronnie going around the corners sideways and whatever else, and had been trying to emulate him.
Oh, that is incredible, isn't it? That well, I suppose that probably falls into the line of never meet your heroes uh, type thing, because obviously there. But well, from my understanding, was Ronnie might have complained about how he was driving on track, but Gilles was very popular with the other drivers, just as a person and human being off track. They may have I presume Ronnie might have just been fearful of this kid going, you know what, this guy's quick and he's come out of nowhere. I believe he lied about his age. I think he entered F1 when he was 27, but he lied and said he was 2 years younger because he didn't want to be seen as too old for the sport.
Well, he said he was born in 52 when it was actually 50, because it was exactly that. He was worried about being seen as too old, because he took a very odd route into F1. Obviously, that's not the same route as a lot of other people took. If you're in Europe or you've come over to Europe, you're like messing in F4, F3, F2. It's not too dissimilar to what we'd understand it now. But going from snowmobiling through to Formula Atlantic, to the only reason you got noticed was because of a one-off race where the Formula One guys came over, for a bit of like play money and what have you. That's a jump. It's a serious jump.
It's a serious jump, and it's a serious jump that obviously it wasn't smooth sailing. I would probably describe, obviously, Max Verstappen was much younger, but Max Verstappen did a lot of his learning obviously in the public eye of Formula One, and the jump and step that Gilles Villeneuve had to make coming into F1 is pretty similar, I think, on that. And certainly his early years within the sport were encapsulated by a lot of mistakes that, even to the fact that with his first season with Ferrari, I think by the end of the season, some people were calling for him to be dropped because his performances of driving on the edge and mistakes were far too common and he wasn't getting great results.
Yeah. The thing is, he came in for the last two races of 1977, and it was basically a car he hadn't drove at all that Nicky had largely set up, which was veering towards sort of understeer more. And the first race was his home one in Canada, and the Goodyear tyres they had just couldn't heat up in those conditions. And but he just couldn't get comfortable in the car at all, um, make it work for him. 'Cause it just did not suit his style whatsoever, and he'd had no time to try and get used to it. And the both first two races both ended up in crashes. The one in Japan basically hitting into Ronnie Peterson, which wouldn't have helped the popularity. The car ended up cartwheeling off the track and landing in what was supposed to be an area that didn't have any people in it. But because some crowd had tried to get in there, a policeman and there was a camera guy in there as well, apparently, had been trying to usher the people back, and debris from Villeneuve's car hit them. He had to hang around for about several days afterwards, obviously, while they went through like police questioning and whatever else. And Ferrari and Tyrrell lawyers had to get involved to get the cars released and to try and get their people back, basically. It was pretty severe.
Yeah, I believe I think it was, one person was killed and 10 were injured in that, weren't they? And yeah, obviously, he was deeply saddened by that, but again, it was still that time, that's still that era of motorsport where, these dangerous things were more of a regular occurrence rather than a rarity. Obviously, they were becoming better. They weren't 50s or 60s Formula One, but they certainly weren't perfect by any means. But I think his path into Ferrari is pretty special because
It's not very often you get a phone. You've had one Grand Prix, you didn't get in the points. McLaren decided they're not going to take your contract up that they had for the following year, and then you get a phone call from Ferrari asking if you wanted to go meet with them.
yeah, I mean, you must be like pinching yourself going, is this real? Is this real? But I believe he'd impressed so much that I think one of the news headlines has said, if you're looking at a future world champion, then you look no further than Gilles Villeneuve, or this young man. I think was the quote itself. And McLaren themselves said that they didn't renew the contract because he was proving that he might be too expensive for them. That might have obviously probably not been on Gilles' wages, but what they would have to pay for him a lot more than somebody else who could probably bring some financial backing to the sport as well. But
So,
yeah,
some of it was having seen him spin on every corner. There was an argument, or maybe he might have too many accidents. Um, the thing is, they were also watching Patrick Tambay, who had been at the Grand Prix race, Silverstone racing an ensign, sorry, and who would eventually take up that seat. Patrick, I think, if I remember correctly, would actually take over the 27 Ferrari after Gilles' accident as well. The pair of them became very good friends, strangely, how it all worked out with Patrick getting the McLaren seat. But
well, I think again there's a common trend of Gilles never really. Well, there is one man that he fell out with, but obviously we'll come to that later on in the episode. But he generally seemed to get on with everyone and be very welcoming to everyone, and just be, I think, very grateful for the opportunity that was there. And then obviously, yeah, this phone call from Enzo came up, and I think the quote from Enzo is he immediately obviously thought that he looked like Tazio Nuvolari, and he was like, when they presented me with this Piccolo Candese, little Canadian, um, this minuscule bundle of nerves, I immediately recognised him in physique to Nuvolari and said to myself, let's give him a try. And it's very rare that Enzo Ferrari picks drivers, and obviously during his time, he liked to hand select his drivers. So if the great Enzo Ferrari, a man who achieved with his team so much within motorsport, takes a look at you and goes, I want you to drive my car. There, at that time, I don't think there was any bigger, way of endorsing someone endorsing you than Enzo Ferrari for your driving ability.
yeah, Well, he was saying as well as cars, they like to build drivers and stuff as well. And that sort of quote and the picture of the pair of them sitting together is still kind of used for the Ferrari Driver Academy now. Is basically the mantra that's founded on. Um, but a lot of some of the people we heard about it from were obviously at various points during his Formula Atlantic days. Gilles had serious money issues. When he was winning the championship, and I think it was '76, he actually missed rounds because his sponsorship fell through, and he couldn't afford to actually keep racing in it. So obviously he built up a few friends during that time, and one of them got in touch with a guy who knew Walter Wolf. The guy had himself had no real interest in racing. He had nothing to sell that he could put on the side of the car or whatever. But he raised enough money so that Gilles could carry on his racing that year, and the pair of them became close. Um, but the guy, I say, knew Walter Wolf, and when in '77 Gilles was having a couple of moments where he wasn't racing or whatever else, Walter had a Can-Am team, and apparently the car was a complete dog. But the guy who he'd got originally to drive it, who having drove the car and decided he didn't particularly want to drive it, where Chris Amon obviously had ties with Ferrari because he had raced for them, Enzo liked him a lot, and he got to see firsthand because he'd stayed on with Walter Wolf's team as like a driving coach sort of character, you know. He got to see firsthand what Gilles was doing in that car, which was basically just driving the wheels off it and hope for any result. But from Gilles' point of view, he was getting to drive a racing car and getting paid for it, which, you know, happy days. Um, yes, so obviously Chris Amon, Walter Wolf in Enzo's ear from one direction, his chief designer in his ear from another direction, it got him curious. And he sort of said to himself, you know, it's a bet with myself to see if we can. He's obviously got talent. Can we turn him into a championship winning driver?
And it is incredible to kind of take this punt on this kid. And I do wonder, obviously, with the money going around in Formula One nowadays, you know, how many would take the kind of the gamble on this talented kid. I guess probably the last real gamble would be McLaren and how heavily they invested, but at such a young age, in Lewis Hamilton. Yeah, because obviously, you know, his dad working 3 jobs to kind of just get him to the place where he's in an eye, and obviously clearly showed talent, and they're like, we're going to nurture this kid. And well, it hasn't necessarily worked out with McLaren, with only capitalising on one of his world titles, but for the sport of Formula One, we've certainly benefited from that. But yeah, I wonder, would too many teams be prepared to do that nowadays? I suppose with their driver academies, that's what they're saying, but yeah, it feels like a story of the
Driver
past.
academies, of course, they have them at a young age. They get to watch them for years, and then they decide whether they make it or they don't make it. It's not watching one race and going on what a few people say and sticking them in Ferrari. I mean, there was outcry almost that Ferrari stuck Charles in their seat after one season, and they've known him since 2016. You know,
Yeah, it wasn't as big as gamble as what uh, you know it made out. I suppose probably the biggest gamble with that on Charles front going was just the fact that would it upset the would he be enough to support Sebastian Vettel in a title fight? And as it turned out, that he would more than do that and probably upset the whole balance on the team, which has now remoulded in him leading the team. But if we compare that to Gilles Villeneuve, I mean, they're not even comparable in terms of the gamble that it takes. And I think the quote from Gilles himself talking about it, of going, if I had 3 wishes, my first would have been to get into racing, my second would be to get into Formula One, and my third would be to drive for Ferrari. And I think especially even more so, the lure and aura of Ferrari still kind of holds true. You know, I think that's very much been the part of why Carlos Sainz has joined recently to Ferrari. but even back then, even more so, I would say Ferrari was a huge powerhouse in the name and had all the success pretty much at the time. Yeah, it would be anyone's dream to drive for them.
But it was certainly while they were going for a successful period. I mean, Lauda was at like the height of his game. He managed to make the car work. The others not quite so well. But then he did a lot of the development work, so he got it to suit him, which obviously the top drivers tend to do. Um, but yeah, because I mean Enzo Ferrari obviously still being there, still being very much the boss of the team and involved in decisions, and that meant it still was Ferrari. You know, a lot of people complain these days it's too sort of corporate and it's just like the sports armor Fiat or what have you. But then it still very much was, you know, the entity that had won the championships through the 50s and the start of the 60s and the 70s, and with all that history and the link to it. And, you know, you were racing for Enzo Ferrari.
Yeah, I think there's not really much more to say than if you're driving for Enzo Ferrari, it feels a privilege to do that. But yes, his career starts with Ferrari, and well, it would be where his career ends with Ferrari as well. But in 1978, it was certainly a mixed fortune year, a steep learning curve, and you know, this is where that faith, that belief in can we make this guy a Formula One world champion, like honing this raw talent, this uncut diamond, and just kind of can we kind of polish it and make him a star. And I suppose probably coming the end of that 1978 season, where he won the Canadian Grand Prix, and being the only Canadian to date to win the Canadian Grand Prix, it probably felt like a nice reward for the faith that they'd shown in him.
Absolute vindication. That when you're going to races and you're fast and incidents keep happening, sometimes your fault, sometimes not, wrong place, wrong time. Um, a lot of people, especially thrust into a position like that, it would have affected their confidence or whatever else. And being able to keep going and clawing a result out as much as possible, and say getting that win in Canada, it was suddenly confirmation of everything that, you know, the belief that Enzo had had in him, that the people who had brought him to the team had had in him, and you know, an answer in the face of all the newspaper reports and all the people who had said no, we should be getting rid of him. It set him up very nicely for the following year as well.
It certainly did, because 1979 for me was Gilles' best car that he had in his career at Ferrari. I suppose the 1982 one might have worked out differently had things not transpired how they had done for him. But the 1979 season, obviously Jody Scheckter won the title for Ferrari by 4 points, beating Gilles in that season. But Gilles was really, I think, the star of the show within that season. I remember watching highlights of that, the last couple of laps between him and Rene Arnoux in the French Grand Prix. I mean, that is mental racing.
The thing is, in more recent times, I remember, like I say, in more recent times, it was 1998, and it was Alexander Wurz and Michael Schumacher doing similar things round the corners at Monaco, and that lasted about 4 corners before both cars ended up at the race with damage. So I would have said modern cars can't do it because they're not built to take impacts like that. But it doesn't really count as modern, does it?
No, no, it doesn't. And well, I guess also we don't know, would they, if those cars have made the end of the race, if that had come, say, through the midway part of the race. It was, I think a mixture of, Rene and Gilles going, that last lap through the first few corners is absolutely insane, where they're just bumping tyres. Rene gets past, flies over a curb, and so Gilles then gets past him and then is able to hold off for the rest of the lap. And it's a fantastic end to the race and claiming second place, and obviously upsetting the crowd a bit. Obviously, Gilles Villeneuve, having been Canadian, some French connection and French link there, but the French-based Renault team and obviously the French René Arnoux would have helped seeing a French 1-2 in that race. I've said French a lot there. But he certainly
Renault
upset the
got a
apple cart.
1-3 in that. They won their first race, and all anyone was talking about was the battle for second.
Which they certainly probably weren't happy with, that their limelight was taken in there. But I think that is what shows about Gilles, that he could. It's a perfect encapsulation of his driving on the edge, and he really did, push the limits. And I think he mentioned coming out after the race going, well, that was good fun. I really enjoyed that. Most of the times this ends up with us kind of going over the top of each other and out the race, but that was good. We survived that, and I came out on top. That was great fun.
Well, him and Renault did get a lot of flack for driving like that off some of the other drivers, but the pair of them just enjoyed it so much, getting to actually race wheel to wheel, fighting for every corner, every inch. And that, I think, to them was like, well, this is what racing is about. The full, engagement of battling someone else. And it's war when you're in that situation, I think. But say afterwards, this the measure of them that they got out of the cars and sort of shook hands and went on being friends. Two drivers having that sort of coming togethers on track and fighting for it these days. A, the cars would have been broken, and B, they probably wouldn't have been talking to each other for a while.
Yeah, there certainly would be. I think the only driver who would be that would be Sebastian Vettel a little bit. They might have, well, no, not even him, I'd say, because the guys on the radio now are always very happy to blame the other drivers and kind of put the blame on somebody else. Where back then they were, I think, they had an appreciation of, they were putting their lives in other drivers' hands, and this was a dangerous sport, but they lived for the thrill of it. They were all there for the same reason, because they wanted to win, and they wanted to kind of race. And yeah, there was an element of respect, I think, there, because they were literally putting their lives on the line, weren't they?
Yeah. It's exactly that. It's respect. They know the potential dangers or whatever else. It's fierce racing. You know, was it over the line? A lot of people at a lot of the other races would have said so or whatever. But between the pair of them, the ones engaged in the combat, so they're very much friends. Rene Arnoux to this day is still, he's got links with Renault, he's got links with Ferrari, but he's still very much engaged and very. When you see him on camera talking about Gilles, he's still very animated and very fond of him. They
Mm.
had a great relationship.
And I think the other 2 points to notably say within that 1979 season is the Italian Grand Prix, where I think it shows how much the team Ferrari means to him. And I think this is a very important part of Gilles' personality, that I think it's probably what, endears him to people like you. People like Michael Schumacher got it, Sebastian Vettel, had it. They understand what Ferrari means, and it kind of almost means more. And he could have easily ignored team orders and got past Jody Scheckter at that Grand Prix, and it may have led on to kind of him winning the championship that year. We never know. But yeah, he chose to kind of toe the line in the team game and let Jody win that race.
Yeah. It seems to be a trait with some Ferrari drivers. We've had the conversation before about Peter Collins doing something similar.
Mm.
But yes, Jody, Gilles' answer was basically that Jody was the more experienced driver. He'd been doing it for longer, and that kind of like Peter Collins, Gilles' time would come, was how he saw it. And unfortunately, their fates ended up being very similar.
Yeah, no, that is very true, and I think the other standout in 1979 was the United States Grand Prix, where I think it was in the wet, and he was 11 seconds quicker than anybody else.
Well, it's sort of like everyone else going out tentatively. We're going to put a lap in. It's dangerous. Is it worth us pushing it? Gilles, with his snowmobiling experience, just flat out blasted around the track. I 1 second is a huge margin. 11 seconds to the next fastest guy. Uh, People were looking at him like he'd come from another planet or something. It was just nobody could quite get their heads around the fact that someone had managed to do that, or had gone out and actually done it. Because going around and driving a lap for the sake of getting a feel for the car in the damp or whatever else is one thing. Going out and going the speed he did, that shouldn't have been possible. These are like some of the best drivers in the world, and all of them will have had wet driving experience. To go out and do a lap 11 seconds quicker than the next guy is just insane.
Abs- it, it's just incredible to believe, and it's those special talents who kind of stand out and almost feel like they're driving a different race. In the rain, everyone says that it's a great leveler in terms of driver ability, because it's not just who has the best car, it's who can manage the conditions the best, who can be on the right tyres at the right time, who can just maintain a good level of speed. And it's those drivers, like we spoke about with that quote with Gilles and the snowmobiling, that it really did set him apart and give him almost a step up on his opponents in those sort of conditions, because he's like, well, I've driven in kind of much worse conditions than this. This is almost like driving in the dry for me. Um, it's probably why he had so much confidence driving in the dry, because of the terrible conditions he'd kind of almost based his growth as a driver in his early days on. But yeah, he narrowly missed out on that 1979 season by 4 points, and it would be the closest that he ever came to winning a world title, finishing second in the championship that year.
Yeah, best car he ever had, easily.
Yeah,
Um,
and
Part of the problem for the following years was because of the design of the engine, or what have you, apparently, because I think Ferrari were one of very few teams still using V12s. Um, but they couldn't fit skirts and um, the ground effect. Basically, because of the design of the engine, they had trouble getting the ground effect to work properly on the Ferrari in 80 and 81. So obviously, whereas everyone else was piling ahead for it and getting it to work, on the Ferrari they couldn't. So they had no pace through the corners, ridiculously powerful engine on the straights, which meant basically they were driving a truck for the next couple of years, and obviously that caused some frustration. I mean, you can think they were saying Schecter's 1980 season, that was the most disastrous defensive title in history. I think he got I can't remember the exact figures, but I don't think he barely got 4 points that year.
he got 2 points, um, and retired at the end of that year because it must have been utterly demoralising. Champion of the world, you know, uh, with Ferrari, one of those biggest kind of achievements that you could possibly do in your career. And next thing you know, you're in one of the worst cars on the grid. Well, maybe not one of the worst cars, but just a car that just wasn't working compared to everything else.
And I know
And
they talk about the highs and lows of motorsport, but it doesn't get much more dramatic than that.
yeah, no, absolutely. And the 1980 wasn't really a season of note for Gilles either. But 1981, I suppose, kind of leads up into is almost like the start of the end of the journey that he would experience with Didier Pironi coming into the team, and Didier Pironi saying that Gilles had a little family at Ferrari, but he made me welcome and made me feel at home overnight, and treated me an equal in every way. And again, it's another example of the type of character that Gilles was, and I think it would also lead the base of how obviously Gilles would react to an incident in the 1982 season. But I also, obviously mentioning that 1981 and 80 car not being able to work, the Harvey Postlewhite, who was part of the Ferrari design team, I think he's got his quote here: "The car literally had 1/4 of the downforce that, say, Williams or Brabham had. It had a power advantage over the Cosworths for sure, but it also had a massive throttle lag at the time. In terms of sheer ability, I think Gilles was on a different plane to the other drivers. To win those races in 1981 at Monaco and Jarama on tight circuits was quite out of this world. I know how bad that car was." And obviously you have a little bit of favouritism because he was linked to the Ferrari car, but
Yeah, but the thing is, he was responsible for a lot of the work behind trying to make it better. So outright stating it's a terrible car, it's not really what you'd expect from the person whose job it is to try and make it. I mean, Harvey Postlethwaite was an amazing designer. A lot of the random stuff you saw turn up at Tyrrell in later years, he was responsible, among other things. He knows how to make a good racing car. So he does understand that stuff very well about what's good and what's bad about a car. If he's coming out and saying that about a car that he's responsible for, he's not praising the driver up for no reason. He's genuinely in that condition.
yeah, absolutely. And I think even in that quote, you can just tell how amazed he was by the ability that Gilles did. I mean, everyone knew by this stage how good a talent he was at Ferrari, but it felt like it was culminating. And moving on to obviously 1982, it probably felt like they had a great driver in Didier Pironi, had a brilliant driver in Gilles Villeneuve, both pretty equally matched. I think we're within that aspect, both exciting talents within the sport. But I suppose what happened at Zolder between the two, obviously, Gilles both going into fuel-saving modes after both the Renaults. Oh, yes. And both having the kind of retirements of the Renaults in that race. And what was it? Which was it? FOCA, who had kind of were having a protest, and only some of the cars.
They were all apparently going to be staying out originally, but for sponsorship reasons, some of them ended up turning up anyway. So there was enough cars in the race to kind of have a proper race with points and stuff. Because obviously, if all of them had not turned up, that would have been about a significant proportion of the grid, and I don't think that would have been able to have it as a proper championship race. But in the end, they managed to have enough cars to carry on with it anyway. The Renaults were very Renault-like and broke down, which just left the Ferraris, who had a better grasp on the reliability with their turbo engine at that point and could actually get to the end of the race.
Yeah, and that is where the controversy comes in, because it was to Gilles' understanding that they would maintain position as part of the slowing down, and Pironi had it that they were still racing. And I believe Pironi said in later years about the incident, about him, Gilles, was it Tambay who was driving for Renault at the time, and Prost? It was whoever the other. There it was. It was the other Renault driver with Alain Prost, and they'd made this agreement that they would drive conservatively for the first half of the race, and then the second half of the race they would let loose in terms of things. And there are multiple stories that maybe didn't back up Gilles' belief on it, but at the end of the day, Gilles was deeply hurt because I suppose he would have viewed himself that he was the experienced member within that Ferrari team, and just like he did for Jody Scheckter back in the Italian Grand Prix in 1979, I think he expected Didier Pironi to do the same and, you know, do the thing for Ferrari that would come over the line. And when obviously Pironi took over at the end, how he welcomed him into the team, Gilles seemed deeply hurt, and it's the only story I've heard of him falling out with anyone in the F1 paddock.
There is another guy in the F1 paddock he apparently didn't get on very well with. Prior to joining Ferrari, he actually had an interview with Bernie Ecclestone about joining Brabham, and apparently the pair of them just could not stick each other. But when you think about the kind of character Bernie is and the kind of character Gilles is, I suppose it's not a surprise the pair of them didn't gel.
No, I suppose when you put it like that, yes, that isn't a surprise that those two didn't gel. But obviously, the falling out of this, Gilles said that he would never speak to Didier Pironi again in his life, and unfortunately, you know, then we get to the sad part of the story where during qualifying, and I think it was said that it wasn't even a qualifying going to be a hot lap in the end. It was going to come into the lap. He unfortunately he moved out, and the car in front, it was a March, wasn't it? He was driving the March. It was Jochen Mass who and they both obviously went right. Gilles flew, and that's one of the most difficult crashes. I mean, watching it live must have been horrendous. But even watching on replay, I think that one really sticks with you in terms of just how bad that one was.
Yeah, I've never watched the actual crash itself because I don't tend to like to do that. But obviously, I've seen stills of the wreckage and stuff, and that the car just detonated. The yeah, I mean, it's a lousy year for that sort of thing. That was not, yeah, um, um, yeah. So my understanding of the qualifying thing was basically Jill very much had it in his head that he had to go out and put a marker down, and perhaps because he wasn't at his calmest, he didn't quite get the lap together. Didier Pironi had ahead of him, and Jill, instead of slowing down, going into the pits to get another set of tyres on, had it in his head that he could still get more out of the set he was on. So, although he shouldn't have been going for a flying lap in terms of the tyres should have been going off, he was still going at racing speed anyway. So it looked like maybe he was trying for another flying lap.
Yeah, I think with it is no. It was such a tragic loss of life, and it's one of those. You know, we've unfortunately too much had so many stars of the sport over the years, and thankfully, you know, today it is the sad and tragic events that happened to Anton Hubert last year. It's more of a rarity that these things and a freak accident rather than back then it was still a fairly common and regular, even, you know, in the 80s with ground effect. I think it was one of the final nail in the coffins that, you know, they just weren't ready for this type of technology to use it safely. And it is difficult to talk about kind of losing such a talent as he was, and it moves us on to his legacy, because we've spoken about him being a nice guy, and we've spoken about him obviously driving this car on the edge, but the guy has has a statue outside of Ferrari. He has a whole circuit named after him in Montreal. Obviously, Didier Pironi later that year had a career-ending injury in both his legs as well, and sadly passed away in 1987 with a motorboat incident. But both his kids were called by his wife Gilles and Didier in kind of remembrance of the both. And I believe actually Gilles, I don't know if he still works for Mercedes, but I'm pretty sure he joined Mercedes in 2014. And it's quite nice that there's a legacy in that. And obviously the biggest legacy, I suppose, is the fact that Gilles' actual son Jacques, although not like his father, became an Indy 500 champion, won the Indy Championship and became a Formula One World Championship, which his father was never able to do. And there seems to be footnotes in history all over of Gilles, and it's incredible that he was able to inspire that much.
The thing with Gilles is there were people afterwards, I forget which driver, who basically said, finding out that Gilles had died, it felt at that point like the last innocence in the paddock had been lost. There were a lot of people who were crying that day, and Ferrari themselves packed up and went home. And as you were saying, at that point, they were still very much used to people dying on track and having big incidents. So for that level of reaction, it wasn't in keeping with the time. That he was just the driver. He was the most enigmatic, the most flamboyant, the most outrageous driver on the grid. He was, the bravest driver. Racing drivers as a breed are very, very brave people, but they looked at him like, how can he even do that? I think to a certain extent, he almost got forgotten about for a few years after Senna came along, because
Yeah,
there was
I
suddenly another driver who was doing this, and of course Senna ended up dying as well. But they're two drivers who are very sort of similar in terms of both passionate, both racers, both fast and aggressive. Um, and that's maybe dented Gilles' legacy a little bit in terms of whereas once upon a time, he was that name that stood out, but he was the one everyone talked about and everyone remembered and whatever else. And if you're a Ferrari fan and there's the statue, Fiorano's circuit is on the Via di Gilles Villeneuve, and the statue is sitting on the corner of it, you know who he is. But I think for the wider Formula One community now, it's like they just need to study a bit more into the history before his name comes up than perhaps once upon a time.
I think you make very good comparisons between Senna and Gilles, and obviously, during this time where we've not had racing, a young guy who was born in '93, before the time of both, well, after the time of both Gilles and, well, Senna, realistically, because I was one by the time Senna passed away and had no real recollection of anything of the world around about then. So it's looking back and reflecting on these guys, and I think the best way for me to describe those, obviously, I look at why kind of people like Senna, why people like Gilles Villeneuve resonate with people. Is you had the champions like the Lauders, you had the champions like the Prosts, and all you could do was admire them. Like, they had incredible performances by themselves, but you admired what they did. People like Gilles Villeneuve and Ayrton Senna made you love F1. They kept you on the edge of your seat. They made you question what was possible in a race car. They made you think, how does he do that? People love to see Yeah, and it's those type of drivers. I think the closest we have to it in modern day is Max Verstappen. He feels like one of those drivers who does, but even then, I think it's difficult now because what adds to their, I think, allure is the fact that there was still that element of risk in the sport, because you were like going, wow, they're doing that at 200 mile an hour, and if this goes wrong, which unfortunately, for both of them, eventually it did go wrong, they could lose their lives. But both of them,
They are the embodiment of, what can happen, the highs and the lows. Um, and, it's like the Ferrari film itself, Raced into Immortality. Gilles was another example of that. So was Ayrton, albeit not for Ferrari, but it's that thing of the people we remember for what they did, what they achieved, and what happened. It's the part of the story and the fabric of F1. Everything is built on something else, and unfortunately, at that time, it was people's lives.
yeah, it really was, and I'm glad, obviously, that we've built and progressed on from there. But these guys that are in the past of the sport, it's incredible looking back what they did and achieved. So it's been brilliant chatting about Gilles with you, and I know obviously he's someone that you describe as your favourite driver because of that. He evokes raw emotion. I think Gilles, in the way that he drove a race car, and like you didn't watch him at the time when he was actually racing, but even just looking back, being a Ferrari man, there's something that resonates with you. So I'll ask you, David, to if you can, what do you think is Gilles Villeneuve's legacy?
What can you say about Gilles and his legacy? Um, I think it would have been slightly different, perhaps, if 2 years after he had died, there hadn't been another young charger coming along who people were drawn to. Magnetic personality, who would then go on to win titles himself and then die as well. And I'm, of course, talking about Ayrton Senna. Um, so now, when people are like looking at those kind of drivers, obviously he's front and center, and Gilles been shifted off to more of a cult hero. Um, there are certain factions, of course, of Formula One fandom that he appeals to very much. Uh, Obviously, in Ferrari, he's absolutely massive. The Fiorano track is down the Via de Gilles Villeneuve. He's the only driver who has a statue of him in Maranello. Um, and then, of course, there's the various Ferrari fan clubs. Outside Italy, the one with the biggest membership is obviously the ones in Canada. They're bigger than the ones in England, they're bigger than the ones in France, they're bigger than the ones in Belgium, bigger than the ones in America. They are the biggest worldwide, other than that, in Italy itself. So, and then, of course, Canada's racetrack is Circuit de Gilles Villeneuve. He's there if you know where to find him, and if people get the chance to look into his story and his in more detail, he's such a fascinating character to look at. It's just a pure driven racer with almost nothing in the way of compromise. He had his idea about the world and how he should be and how people should be and what racing should be, and that was the code he lived by. No room for anything else. There's priorities. There was racing, there was his family, and that was pretty much it. It's kind of like a simple, idealistic life almost. And you could argue that he was perhaps a little naive. Um, if you look at Didier Pironi, for example, and of course the problems there that led to Gilles' death, Didier Pironi was a driver who we'd recognise now. You know, he worked within the sport and within the team to better his own position. And we expect that of modern drivers, you know, ever since Lauda came along, and that was the way he operated, and Prost was the same. And now, like the incident at San Marino, for example, we wouldn't think anything of that happening now. If you look at like the multi 21 incidents and the various, you know, Rosberg Hamilton incidents and whatever else, it's sort of become, and the Ferrari ones as well last year, it's sort of become almost accepted that that sort of thing happens because a driver will look after himself almost all the time, especially if they're fighting for something like important. You know, they spend their whole lives racing to win and do the best results they can. Um, I genuinely think that Didier Pironi didn't understand that Gilles wasn't looking out for his own best interests either. You know, it's a clash of personalities and how they thought, and unfortunately, it led to some incredibly unfortunate consequences. But you know, after Sterling lost, Gilles is seen as the guy, probably second on the list, who should have been a world champion and wasn't. And almost in the same way, I suppose, it's sort of, you know, here's like the legend that is, the myth that was Gilles Villeneuve. You know, I don't think it's possible to overstate his importance in certain circles, and he is a cult hero. But I'm rambling now. But he certainly means a lot to Ferrari fans. Yeah, thank you.
So guys, we got so carried away in recording, actually I lost the battery, so you've just heard David's, what he thought Gilles' legacy was, and that's a tough act to follow, as, you know, Gilles is so important, I think. Well, you know, he's David's favourite driver, so there's always that personal attachment, and he summed up his legacy well. For me, Gilles' legacy is, he was a fantastic talent, and he falls into that category of certain what-ifs. And, you know, sadly, you know, he came at a time where the sport wasn't televised as much, and some of his brilliant battles, you know, were missed. And I don't think, I think he is still remembered fondly. You know, obviously he has a circuit named after him. He has a statue, you know, outside Ferrari. You know, there are all hints of memory, but in general kind of F1 and stuff, he's maybe one of these forgottens, and I guess he was never allowed to kind of blossom into the F1 great that he might have come. But for someone who had such a short stint on the sport, he left a lasting impact on people, and that's huge for a legacy. Obviously his son went on to become a Formula 1 world champion himself, and yeah, he had someone named after him. Obviously Didier Pironi's children were named after him, and, you know, one went on to work for Mercedes. Gilles just was that rare kind of person, someone who loved what he did, loved, you know, just going out there and giving his absolute best, pushing himself to the limit, seeing, you know, there was a line, how far could he push that line up, and, you know, how good could he be. He certainly was, as a human being, a person who pushed himself to the limits, but away from that was just a really great person. He was kind, he was caring, he, you know, he was a family man, and I think I've said it often in these F1 legacies, the biggest legacy you can leave is how you are remembered by the people you left behind. And with Gilles, there isn't really a bad word to say about him, which is a fantastic legacy. And it is a shame that we never got to see the talent that Gilles might have become, or he already was, but to really express himself. But he was still incredible for what he gave, and if you go back and watch highlights of how he raced, it is just absolutely brilliant to watch even today, and it gives you a true appreciation of the talent of what he was. And to be not even a world champion, to have only won 6 races, which for some people never win a race, and some people never get close to winning a championship, but to be remembered like he was, and not to have had the success in the sport of other people who we've done F1 Legacies on, it's a real mark of how good a driver Gilles Villeneuve was. But that's it. That is Gilles Villeneuve F1 Legacy. I've really enjoyed this chat. It's been absolutely brilliant, and he is a fantastic driver. And yeah, it's been fantastic to chat him over with you, David. So thank you so much for coming on.
No, thank you for having me. It's been great to talk to you. I always enjoy coming on here and talking to you. It's always fun. I wouldn't necessarily say this one's been fun, but it's been very good to talk about, Gilles and everything that happened to him and his life and legacy. And hopefully, some people who didn't know him so well might appreciate him a little bit more for having watching this.
No, thank you very much for coming on, David. But that's it from us today, guys. Gilles, a brilliant driver, and I hope you've enjoyed kind of learning a little bit more about him and going into a bit more in depth of what he was like as a driver and as a person. It's really been great to kind of reflect on his short but exciting career. And yeah, that's it from me today, guys. So for now, you F1 fans, keep racing.